My name is Jonathan, and I have never been a superstitious man. Like most people, I grew up not believing that the forest hid anything other than the usual beasts and silence. However, that night I changed my mind forever. I often fished alone on one old lake, which the locals called Black Mirror. It got its name because of the deep, dark waters that reflected the sky as if you were looking into a bottomless well. The lake was far from civilization, surrounded by a dense forest where people rarely entered. That night I arrived at the lake late in the evening to spend a few days there alone with nature, as I often did. My boat was slowly gliding along the calm surface of the water when I noticed something strange. Small lights flashing above the water. At first I thought they might be fireflies, but they behaved very differently. The lights seemed to play with each other, moving to the beat of invisible music. Their movements were mesmerizing. I decided to stop the boat and drop anchor while watching these unusual lights. However, with each passing minute there were more of them. They began to approach me, and I felt a cold fear run down my spine. My common sense was telling me to leave, but there was something about those lights that made me want to stay. And then, when they were almost touching my boat, I heard a sound, a faint, low whisper, coming as if from under the water. I bent down to make out the words and almost let go of my oar when I realized I heard my name. Jonathan! Jonathan! The sound was barely audible but clear. My blood froze in my veins, and I immediately reached for the engine to get away. But before I could do anything, figures began to appear from the water, dark, faceless, but undoubtedly human. The figures slowly rose from the depths, as if reaching for the surface to escape from the watery captivity. Their blurred silhouettes seemed to be made of pure darkness. They had no faces and made no sounds, just moving ominously towards my boat. My hands were shaking as I tried to start the engine, but it was stubbornly silent, as if it itself was resisting my efforts to escape. The lights around me flickered, casting strange shadows on the water, which only added to the eeriness of what was happening. As the first figure nearly reached the side of the boat, I felt fear paralyze my every movement. It wasn't just fear, it was a terror that gripped my body, as if trying to drag me into the abyss that lay beneath the surface. I was trapped, unable to move or scream, and just watched as these ghostly creatures drew closer and closer. My legs closed around the oar and I swung hard, tearing the dark silhouette apart. But instead of disappearing, the figure split into two separate shadows that instantly merged again, becoming even more menacing. Out of desperation, I grabbed the oar with both hands and started beating the water wildly, hoping to somehow stop these creatures. But they did not disappear. There were only more of them, and they kept coming just as inexorably. I was almost ready to abandon the boat and swim back to shore when I suddenly noticed the lights starting to disappear. First one, then another. They faded so quickly that in a moment I was left alone with my fear, surrounded only by darkness and silence. But the dark figures did not disappear. They simply stopped, as if they were waiting. I gasped in terror when I heard a new sound. It was a rustling that shouldn't be in open water. A rustle, similar to movement in tall grass or dry leaves. But it was coming from under the water, right under my boat, and then I realized that they don't scare me. They drive me away. The shadowy figures slowly moved in different directions, and I saw what had become my worst nightmare underwater. It was a hand, a human hand, reaching out from the depths toward my boat. I tried to convince myself that it was only a hallucination, that the shadowy figures and the hand reaching for my boat were just the play of my imagination, caused by the fatigue and darkness of the night. But the reality was ruthless. The hand was too real, too human, with thin fingers reaching out toward me tensely from the water. The engine did not start again. I yanked frantically at the cord, but instead of the sound of the motor, all I could hear was a soft rustle and a slight splash of water as the arm continued to rise. My fingers were sticky with sweat, and I tried again and again to start the engine, but to no avail. Then everything happened very quickly. A hand suddenly appeared above the surface and clung to the side of my boat. I screamed, desperately trying to fight back, but she held on as if she were made of iron. The cold seeped into my bones as I felt the boat begin to tilt to the side under the pressure of the force pulling me down. Suddenly, other hands began to appear from under the water. They all looked alike. They all reached for the boat, grabbing it. My mind refused to accept what was happening, but my body acted on instinct. I grabbed the oar and started thrashing my arms, trying to free myself from their iron grip. But it was in vain. The hands did not let go. They were strong, like living chains that dragged me to the bottom. The boat slowly began to sink under the water. I felt the cold water lick my boots, then my ankles, and after a few seconds the water rose to my knees. It was the moment of truth. I had to decide whether to stay in the boat, hoping for a miracle, or abandon it and try to swim to shore. But then I noticed something that made me stop. Through the semi-darkness of the water, I saw a face. A distorted, old, with long, tangled hair. A face that stared at me with empty eyes. It wasn't just a face, it was a head floating underwater, surrounded by arms reaching out to me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from those soulless eyes that silently stared at me from the depths. My mind finally broke, and I left the boat and threw myself into the water. My arms and legs worked like crazy, rowing to the shore. But the cold fingers had already caught my legs, and I felt myself being pulled back towards the abyss. Something was happening to me, something I couldn't control. The water around me suddenly became heavy and viscous, like a swamp, and my every movement required incredible effort. I could no longer see the shore, only dark waves rising around me, and I felt the darkness engulfing me. And then I heard a voice. He sounded low, almost imperceptible, but I made out the words. It was the same whisper I had heard before, but now it was stronger, clearer. A voice from the water told me to give up the fight and become one of them. The whisper pierced my bones, filling my head with wild terror. Every word that came from the depths was like a hammer blow on my mind. I couldn't tell if it was actually a voice or just an echo of my own fears, rising from the depths of the subconscious. But one thing was clear. This voice wanted one thing, for me to surrender. Jonathan, it's time. The time has come. Stop. Surrender to the darkness. Every word was imbued with a chill that penetrated my body, driving me crazy. The water around me seemed alive. It enveloped me, pulled me down like an insatiable beast that wants to devour its prey. I tried desperately to fight, but my arms and legs grew heavier with each blow. I was gripped by a panic fear, the same fear that appears when you realize that you are on the verge of death. I tried to scream, but the water clogged my mouth and I swallowed the salty liquid that filled my lungs. My mind was already starting to give up, accepting the inevitable. The voice of the abyss became my only reality. He pulled me harder and harder into the darkness. And then, when I could no longer fight, something inside me ignited. A primitive survival instinct that made me fight for my life again. I gathered all my will into a fist and began to beat with my feet and hands, trying to escape from the embrace of this bizarre abyss. The water began to recede, but it was extremely difficult, as if I was breaking free from the tentacles of an invisible monster. And then I felt the fingers holding me begin to let go. The hands pulling me down disappeared one by one in the darkness, and the voice began to recede, to lose its power. I don't know how long I struggled, but when I finally felt the bottom under my feet and got to the shore, I was completely exhausted. My lungs ached from lack of air. I coughed up water and felt as if I had just returned from the other world. I was lying on the cold sand, staring at the black sky, and I couldn't believe that I had survived. But the lake behind me no longer seemed quiet. It was filled with anger that splashed in the waves, as if the water itself was angered by my escape. And just then I saw something that caused a new surge of terror. At the far end of the lake, where there was not a single tree, only bare rocks, stood a figure. Tall, dark, motionless. She looked straight at me. I couldn't see her face, but I felt her gaze on me. Heavy, cold, relentless. He was not just an observer. It was the very shadow that lived in the lake, the one that tried to take me away. And I realized that this is not the end. Whatever it is, it won't leave me alone. I kept my eyes on the figure standing at the far end of the lake. My heart was beating so fast I could feel it pounding in my ears, drowning out even the sound of the water lapping against the shore. She stood still, as if waiting for something or maybe someone, and I understood that this someone was me. The figure didn't move. but there was something eerie about its presence, something that made me want to get as far away as possible from here. However, the fear and exhaustion were so great that I could not bring myself to get up. I was shackled with terror that pierced me to the bones. And then I felt a strange burning pain on my right hand. I felt like the water was still filling my lungs, and I coughed, but when I looked down at my hand, I saw something horrible. A dark mark appeared on my wrist that looked like burnt skin. It wasn't just a burn, it was something more. It was as if some of the darkness of the lake had left its mark on my skin. The sign was in the shape of a circle with strange symbols inside that I couldn't make out. They pulsed with a red light that made them seem alive. The pain was excruciating, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mark, feeling that it was now a part of me. Time seemed to stand still, and all I could hear was my heavy breathing and the pulsation of this mysterious sign. I looked back at the figure on the rocks, and it was gone. In its place, only darkness remained, which slowly spread along the edge of the lake. I understood that this was a warning. I was released, but not forever. The darkness has left its mark on me to always remember that I escaped, but could not fully escape its clutches. I got up with the last of my strength and staggered towards my car, which was parked not far from the lake. My clothes were wet and sticky from the water, my legs wouldn't obey, and my head was buzzing. But I had only one thought: to get out of here as quickly as possible. By the time I got to the car, my brain seemed to be on autopilot. I got behind the wheel, started the engine, and pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The lake remained behind, but the horror did not leave me. The mark on my arm throbbed with pain, reminding me of what I had been through. On the way home, I couldn't focus on anything but the road in front of me and this searing pain. When I finally saw the lights of the city, I was relieved. But deep down, I knew the darkness wasn't going to let me go so easily. I didn't know what to do with this mark, how to get rid of it. The only thing I knew for sure was that this mark connected me to something ancient and terrible that I would never be able to understand. And no matter what I do, this darkness will always be there. After reaching the city, I decided not to return home. Something inside me told me that I shouldn't do this, as if my home was no longer a safe place. I checked into the best motel and paid for a room for the night, barely noticing the interested look from the receptionist when he noticed my wet clothes and exhausted appearance. When I finally got into the room, my legs refused to obey and I collapsed on the bed without even undressing. Darkness quickly enveloped me and I fell asleep, but instead of rest, a new challenge awaited me. The dreams were so real that I could hardly distinguish them from reality. In the dream, I was again near the same lake, but now the water was unnaturally calm, as if frozen. I was standing on the shore watching the surface, when suddenly the same hands that tried to drown me began to appear from the water. They rose slowly, gasping for air, but this time I wasn't in the boat. I was at the edge of the bank, right in front of them. My hand, which had the mark on it, began to pulse with red light. The searing pain shot through me again, and I looked down to look at my hand. The sign became even brighter, almost unbearable. He seemed to live his life like a hot coal pulsing with fire. I felt the darkness begin to emanate from the sign, spreading across my skin, engulfing my hand. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. And here, in the midst of that darkness, I saw a face, the face of the same creature that stood on the rocks. It floated out of the water, approaching me. His empty eyes stared straight into me, and I felt my consciousness begin to blur. The darkness had already engulfed my hand and continued to spread throughout my body. The face from the lake screamed silently, opening its mouth as if it wanted to say something, but no sound came out. I was ready for her to absorb me completely, and suddenly I woke up. My lungs filled with air, and my body was covered in cold sweat. My hands were shaking, but I immediately checked my right hand. The sign was still there, but now it looked different. It no longer throbbed red, but it emanated an inexplicable coldness, as if it were drawing heat from my body. I sat on the bed, breathing hard, and tried to collect my thoughts. The dream was so real that it seemed as if I had actually experienced what I saw. The mark on the arm was a reminder of what had happened at the lake, and I knew that this was only the beginning. I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit and wait for the darkness to take me. But where was I supposed to go? Who to turn to for help? These questions swarmed in my head, but there were no answers. I decided not to stay at the motel. Getting out of bed, I gathered my things and quickly left the room. The city was starting to wake up, but I felt that there was no safe place for me anymore. After leaving the motel, I knew I needed to find answers. What is this mark on my arm? And how is it related to what happened on the lake? I knew I couldn't figure it out on my own. I needed some help from someone who knew about such things. I remembered an old man on the outskirts of town who everyone thought was a bit odd. He lived alone in an old house, and people avoided him because he was supposedly a medicine man or even a witch. I never believed in such things, but now I had no choice. If anyone could have known about this sign, it was him. I drove to his house, which was on a hill in the middle of a thick forest. The road was long, and I could not shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The darkness I left behind on the lake seemed to follow me, not letting me go. When I finally reached the old man's house, the sun had already risen, but its light did not bring relief. The house looked old and neglected, but it still stood strong, as if it were a part of this forest. I wasn't sure what to do next, but knowing that standing here and hesitating wasn't an option. I went to the door and knocked. Immediately, the sound of footsteps was heard from the middle. The door opened, and before me stood a man, old as expected, but his eyes were incredibly clear, like a man who had seen more than he could understand. He looked at me intently, and I felt that he immediately knew that something unusual had happened to me. "What brings you here, son?" His voice was low, but full of some strange power. "I need help. Something strange has happened to me, and I don't know what to do," I tried to explain to him, although the words came out confused. I showed him the mark on my hand. His gaze became even more serious, and he leaned closer to get a better look. "It's a mark," he said, his voice full of doubt and worry. "Mark of darkness. It's dangerous, son. Very dangerous." "What does that mean? How can I get rid of this?" I felt panic rising inside me. "Get rid of?" He looked at me thoughtfully. "It's not that simple. The label has already bound you to something beyond human understanding. It is an ancient power that takes those it chooses. But there is a way to stop it." "What should I do?" I desperately wanted to know. "You have to go back to where it all began and find what's left. Something that was forgotten, something that should not have been left behind. Only by returning it will you be able to stop the curse." I felt myself sinking back into the darkness at those words. Back to the lake? Back to where I barely survived? But if this was the only way to free myself from this horror, I had no choice. The old man gave me some instructions, although they were so confusing that I could hardly understand what was being asked of me. He warned me that the road back would be even more dangerous than I could have imagined, and that I might never return. With mixed feelings, fear, and determination, I left his house. I needed to return to the lake, with which I was connected by darkness. But now I was ready to fight. The road back to the lake seemed endless. The trees around me were so dense that sunlight barely filtered through. Each step was difficult, as if the ground itself was trying to stop me. The words of the old man, "Find what was forgotten." But what could it be? When I finally reached the lake, it greeted me with an unsettling silence. The surface of the water was smooth as glass and reflected the dark clouds gathered in the sky. All this time I felt an invisible presence, as if I was being watched from the depths. I approached the shore, holding in my hands the amulet that the old man had given me. He said it could help protect me from the darkness, but I still doubted its power. As I knelt by the water, I remembered the place where it all began, the middle of the lake. I had to get back into the boat and swim to where the darkness tried to swallow me. I knew it would be dangerous, but I understood. There is no other way out. As the boat slowly moved toward the center of the lake, I could feel the chill seeping into my bones. The mark on the hand began to glow, as if responding to the presence of darkness. My heart was beating fast, and every minute seemed like an eternity. Finally, I reached the very place where I almost died. The lake was quiet, but the sense of presence was more than evident. I looked into the water, trying to see something under its surface, and suddenly I noticed something lying on the bottom, glinting in the reflected light. It was an old locket from which all the signs of time had almost disappeared. I didn't know what he meant, but I felt that he was the forgotten one the old man was talking about. It was more than just a decoration. It was part of the darkness that lived in the lake. I reached out to take it, and in that instant the darkness came alive. The cold hands began to pull me down again, but this time I was ready. Clutching the amulet, I tried to resist their power. I understood that now it was not just a fight for my life, it was a fight for my soul. The darkness tried to swallow me, but I held on, clutching the locket and the amulet. I could feel the darkness within the lake struggling to break me. The water around me began to churn, creating a maelstrom that threatened to pull me into the depths. But the old locket suddenly began to glow, emitting a warm light. This beam broke through the darkness, dispersing it. I felt the cold hands loosen their grip and then let go of me completely. The darkness in the lake subsided, and the water became calm again. I, almost without strength, grabbed the boat, trying to stay on the surface. The locket in my hand no longer glowed, but I knew it was the key to the solution. It belonged to someone who died in this lake many years ago and whose soul remained here, chained to the darkness. Now that the locket had been found and the darkness dispelled, I was relieved. In the end, I won. The mark on my arm began to fade, and I realized that I was now free. I returned to the shore where the lake's current calm was absolute. The darkness receded, and I felt as if I had freed myself from its grip forever. Returning to the city, I knew that this was not just a battle for survival. It was a struggle against what remained forgotten and what no one should touch. Now I knew that the lake held its secrets and that they must remain undiscovered. Otherwise, they can absorb you forever.